Welcome to the Ending Sexploitation podcast, where we decode sexual harm and provide you with active solutions. I'm your host, Kaylee McNamara. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode. I am so thrilled to be joined once again by the marvelous Danny Pinter, director of the Nicosi Law Center. Hey, Danny, how's it going?
It's going well. Good to be with you again, Haley.
Today, we have some really exciting news to talk about. Again, so often our podcast, I feel like we're talking about really dark and tough issues. But this is an example of progress. I would call it progress in the fight for accountability and for justice. And that is with the launching of some new lawsuits, groundbreaking lawsuits that have never been done before on behalf of a child victim who was exposed to pornography on mainstream pornography platforms. And this was in contradiction of a state law that had passed age verification legislation. Before we dive into the lawsuit itself, this concept of age verification has been passed in so many different states. Danny, could you just explain a little bit about what that legislation does?
Sure. Especially I think in this context of the pornography industry, there's been talk of age verification with regard to people appearing in the videos, making sure that
Mhm.
they are adults. And then there's age verification to access the website. So this was an age verification law passed in Kansas to make sure that everyone accessing pornographic websites are adults. So
To
that's
prevent childhood
um,
exposure.
to prevent children being exposed to really harmful content on these websites. Exactly. So that's the kind of law that Kansas passed. We believe it is a very reasonable and constitutional law. It essentially says for any website that distributes hardcore pornography, they need to make sure that they employ reasonable age verification to prevent children from accessing that harmful material. So it points back to the harmful to minors statute that Kansas has in its law, which already states, and these laws are old and classic. And for example, kids aren't allowed to go into a store and buy porn, right? They couldn't go into like a sex toy store and buy a pornographic magazine without showing ID. That's existed for a very long time. And it's essentially the same thing, right? For that content that the state says is harmful to minors, hardcore pornographic content, these websites need to make sure that they at least employ a reasonable measure to keep kids off.
And it's interesting because by my count, speaking under correction, I think at least 20 states in America have passed some version of this law, which I think is just a real example of a recognition across the country that pornography is having significant public health harms, mental health harms, and especially for minors who just are so young, their brains are still developing, their understanding of consent being not well informed yet. There's so many specific harms to minors as well as adults. So it's just interesting that this legislation really is catching fire around the country.
Right.
And Kansas was one of these states that passed that law.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly crazy to me that, this hasn't happened yet. And I think that's partly with the law has just struggled to deal with the internet from the beginning. Some sort of the thing is when the internet was first catching fire in the late 90s, Congress kind of knee-jerk tried to solve some of these problems quickly with rushed and not well-formed legislation that failed. And that has since scared off legislatures from regulating the internet to protect kids in addition to other things like there's section 230. There was the explosion of growth of the internet, and now we have these big tech companies that are constantly lobbying Congress. So it's all these elements that have combined to really make the internet a lawless place, which it
Mhm.
really shouldn't be. And so I agree with you, Haley. I think it's fascinating that, I think you're right. It's something around 20 states have passed these laws. It's fascinating. And it's a reflection of, I think, the societal issue we're really reckoning with now. And we're seeing this with the passage of Take It Down Act. And now we have the No Fakes Act introduced, that Congress
Mhm.
is ready and recognizing what the American people are calling for, which is we live a lot of our lives on the internet, and it needs to be a safe place. There's no reason that the laws that we deal with every day should not also apply in the virtual world. And that's what these age verification laws are. Like I said, we already have these laws in the physical world. Kids have
Mhm.
to use IDs to buy, they couldn't buy cigarettes without, right? They'd be ID'd. Kids can't go in the grocery store and try and buy alcohol. Everyone gets ID'd at the grocery store. If you're a gambling establishment, again, IDs. And it's long recognized principle that for pornographic content, that's age gated. So this is just the same thing online.
And one of these states, Texas, has one of these age verification
Yeah.
laws that is up at the Supreme Court for review. So just flagging that for people that we are tracking that case, that decision is expected soon, anytime in the next couple of months. And we will have an episode, a podcast episode, as soon as that decision comes out, and we'll talk about what the impacts of that are. So it's a very interesting time to be talking about age verification because we're waiting for this decision, and the way that that goes will impact a lot in that movement.
For sure. I'm so
Mhm.
glad you mentioned that, Haley. It's going to be very historic. So exactly, Texas passed one of these laws, and it was challenged. So the Supreme Court's reviewing it, and probably a decision will come out in June. And this is right on exactly what I mentioned, which is the Supreme Court is re-reviewing a decision from like the 90s, early 2000s, where a poorly written age verification measure failed constitutional scrutiny. And so it's incredible to think about that in 2025, this is the first real time that we've tried again.
Yeah.
But it's probably, a good time because the internet's very mature. We don't have these arguments that it can't handle anything. We have technology that shows age verification is there. Very possible that, respects privacy, that's non-invasive, we're not having to
Yeah.
wonder about, oh, you have to like
It's not
that was what they were
identity
concerned.
verification. Mhm.
They were dealing with that in the 90s too, like, is it a credit card? Is it this? Is that? And they weren't even very clear to the court of what the age verification measure would be and what it would look like, which was problematic. So, I think it's a good time, but it absolutely it'll be landmark, right? It'll be setting the tone for what can we do to protect kids online going forward and,
Mhm.
in dealing with the First Amendment and the internet and all those things. So, absolutely, we'll have to do a whole episode, and it's gonna be soon, probably June, but it could be any day now. So, very timely.
Yeah, very timely, but the law did pass in Kansas, and so Kansas has had this on the books law that pornography websites need to keep minors off of their platforms, and that's where this lawsuit comes in, and I think that this lawsuit, which Nkosi is, one of the leaders of, it's really fascinating, and I think it really is representative of a lot of people's stories because the story involves parents who were doing everything that they could to keep their children off of pornography platforms to protect them, to prevent exposure, and they lived in a state where they had this age verification law, and yet the child was still exposed, which just shows why we need to be enforcing these kinds of laws and enforcing more accountability on the tech side because parents can't solve this problem alone. But could you just tell the story of this child who was exposed, the impacts that they had, and just what all happened that led to this lawsuit?
Sure, absolutely. So, we're keeping the child and his mother's names anonymous, for their privacy, but our client, he was about 14 years old. His mom was very vigilant about, um, locking down devices, making sure he didn't have a device in his room at night. She knew she had all kinds of filters and everything on computers, phones, all of that. She really understood the dangers and did everything she could to protect her son. But kids will find a way, right? He discovered that in the back of a closet, there was an old laptop that the mom forgot even existed, and he was able to pull that out, dust it off, and, connect to Wi-Fi. And so this was an old laptop, so it didn't have all the protections. The mom forgot about it. So he was able to connect to Wi-Fi and access pornographic content. And so we started doing that, and despite the Kansas law, and despite that, and this is something we point out, the websites were geo-targeting this kid, right? And this is how all these
Mm.
websites work, but they know where you're logging in from. And so I'm sure these tech companies will act like, "Well, how do they we couldn't know." It's like they know. And Pornhub
Mhm.
has even revealed this, right? Where we see that when these age verification laws passed in protest, Pornhub has blocked its services to certain states, like not
Right.
available in Florida because they passed an age verification law. Well, this is true of all these websites because especially the free websites, which being free is why they're so available to children because anyone can just get on immediately. You don't have to pay or anything. And the way they make money is by using your location to target ads to you, right? It's the ad revenue.
Mm.
So they knew he's logging in from Kansas and they're sending him ads based on his location. And they just didn't follow the law. They just blatantly did nothing to and that's the law says reasonable age verification measure. So it was up to them to do what would have been reasonable for their website, but they didn't do anything. They either did absolutely nothing or had like the click the box thing, which is not reasonable age
Mhm.
verification to prevent a child from accessing the site. And so as a result, he was almost immediately exposed to very hardcore content, right? This isn't Playboy. These are hardcore, explicit sexual acts. And what's
Mhm.
really disturbing is that in just about a month of time of this going on, he was escalating to more and more extreme content. And those ads that I mentioned that he was being sent from this website, a lot of them were meetup ads, right? Telling him, hey,
Wow.
do you want to meet up with this girl and this woman, right, in your area? Those are escort ads
Mhm.
at best. At best, at
Prostitution. Yeah.
worst, this child could have been lured to meet who knows what kind of predator in person, right? It could have really devolved into something horrible, and that was served up to him from the website. He shouldn't have been able to access at all in the first place. So the child actually was getting so out of control and so distraught that the reason that this stopped is he himself went to his mom and asked for help, basically told her what was going on, and that he wasn't able to get away from the situation. And he even could recognize that it was hurting him. And so his mom, got him help, took the device away, right? Got him some help and was mad for her son, really upset that her son should have been protected because her state had passed a law to protect her son from this very thing. So we are suing these websites for violating the law and some other various torts like failure to warn, products liability, those kinds of injuries.
And so these are suits against multiple websites,
Yes.
at the same time, and these are the first American US lawsuits that are suing pornography websites for violating age verification laws. It's really a cutting edge. You're really at the cutting edge of legal theory, I assume,
Absolutely.
and also the front lines of, children who have been harmed by this. I would love to dig into as much as is feasible, because I know whenever we're talking about lawsuits that Nicosia is involved in, we always have to be really conscientious around the survivor experiences and also confidentiality around the case, that not everyone at the organization knows. The lawyers have their own confidentiality shield around the cases. But I would be really interested if we could talk about the harms and the experiences that this child made. And before we dive into that, we could even look a bit generally. I just sent Tim along a link for a flyer that we have that we will add into the show notes around the most dangerous playground being now in our kids' pockets. And this is just a simple 3-pager fact sheet that talks about some of the harms that children experience online, especially around pornography. And on this front page, it says, that there's a survey of minors of 73% had reported consuming pornography. 15% first saw pornography at age 10 or younger. That so often what they're being exposed to is violent. And you shared that about this case, that what he saw first on these sites was not Playboy, it was extremely violent content. Um, Here, this study, a survey found that 52% of 13 to 17-year-olds exposed to pornography saw violent pornography, including choking, someone in pain. And if you go down further in this flyer, there's just so many examples. There's so much research, and I think that's why now is a time when these kinds of lawsuits are possible because there is so much established research. There's not only the harms that maybe an individual or individuals experienced who are the survivors involved in litigation. There's so much documentation that it's not about what even happened to one person. These are predictable trends
Yeah.
that we see of childhood exposure to pornography being linked to, viewing sexual violence, to being more likely to self-produce child sexual abuse material, poor academic achievement, mental health harms, social disorders, even links, to be more likely to struggle with pornography use later in life. So I just think it's fascinating that now is a time when these lawsuits are possible because we have all of this research, and then also people who are willing to come forward and share as well.
You're absolutely right. And another thing that really concerns me about this issue and why I think this case is so important is the way that these websites are themselves grooming these children and making them very vulnerable to in-person abuse. Some of
Mhm,
the two most popular themes on the most popular web pornography websites are teen and incest. So, and the combination, which is often like teacher, student, stepdad, stepdaughter, those are the
mhm,
most popular names. So now you have a child, without a fully developed brain, having their first sexual experiences, consuming this kind of content. Of course, that is going to break down their barriers to the taboo of incest, that's wrong, the taboo of power dynamic or adult-child relationships, right? They've literally
mhm,
been consuming content that fetishizes adults with minor content, and that is literally how we're grooming a generation to be very vulnerable to sexual abuse, and then it was so alarming to see how it played out with this child that he was then being sent meet up in person ads. Um,
mhm,
you know, the combination of those things is frightening, and why it's outrageous that these websites would not be doing everything they could to keep children off their sites from the get-go. And then when they're actually obligated by law to do it, to refuse is just unconscionable. We just absolutely cannot accept it. And now, just as I'm talking, it just makes me think about, we have these social media companies who are just profiting off of kids being harmed, and they won't do anything. We can't, and that trickles down, right? So then the big tech companies promote Section 230 and promote this, being insulated from any kind of accountability for what happens on their sites. And you know who else gets to come and hide in that shadow is these
mhm,
really bad actor pornography websites where they are getting the same benefit, but with playing with even more dangerous fire, right? Playing with
mhm,
on their website is potentially very harmful to a child. And they are similarly, they've been insulated or tried to be insulated. So that's why I think it's so important that we pass these age verification laws and that we bring these lawsuits when these laws are not followed. Because without their pocketbooks being hit, it's more profitable to let kids on the site. Teens are probably a massive portion of their audience. They're not going to keep teens off their site when it makes them money unless it costs them
mhm.
more on the end.
Yeah, and you're so right for going back to Section 230, which is just like a drumbeat that we have to keep coming back to because it is just that problem of incentives. Again, we're seeing it like not only with big tech, but like you said, also with these pornography platforms. And actually, there was a recent New York Times article by op-ed by Nicholas Kristof that analyzed this issue of how pornography companies are really just getting away with so many harmful things. The title of it was These Internal Documents Show Why We Shouldn't Trust Porn Companies. And it just shows how this it's just an examination of actually another lawsuit that I believe Nkosi is involved in, and some documents. Um, but there is a really interesting point in it where he talks about internal documents indicate that Pornhub, as of May 2020, had over 700,000 videos available on their site that had been flagged by users for depicting or assaults on children or other problems. Pornhub did not review a video for possible removal until it had been flagged at least 16 times. And he goes on to say the company also made it much more difficult to flag problem videos, allowing only registered users to do so. And one internal message noted this will, quote, greatly reduce overall flag volume. So that's just one example. There's like so much more that he talks about in that article. There's so much more that's been revealed in other places that I'm sure we'll continue to talk about, especially around that lawsuit at a different time. But it just shows that the incentives of these companies are not aligned with the welfare of anyone. Not like anyone,
Exactly,
not the adults, not the people depicted, not children. It's just all about
and
profits.
it's all about profits, and that quote of "This will reduce flag volume," that encapsulates so perfectly the way that corporations operate, and everyone out there listening needs to understand that. You they m put they have a f so they have a moderation team and the ability for users to flag videos, so they can say, "We moderate, we allow users to report, and we process those reports. We're doing everything right." Yet internally, they create so many barriers to that system, intentionally making the system not function well, dysfunctional, so that then the end result is they won't even see or won't even remove the content because they don't want it to work, because if it works, they'll have less content. That is universal across the board. We have seen
Yeah.
similar activity by Meta and these other tech companies where they, on paper, have systems for safety, but they intentionally don't work so that
Mhm.
they aren't reviewing, don't know, or even, you know, intentionally not taking stuff down because it makes them
Yeah.
money. I mean, that is how
Mm.
they will continue to function because at the end of the day, they can use that little line for PR that they have it. The only reason they even have it is for PR. We'll just put that right now because without liability, they wouldn't even have it at all because they could never be sued.
Mhm.
So you have
Mhm.
this reality of like they don't want it to work because it costs money for it to work and it would lessen profit for it to work. And they could never be sued. So that equation will always equate to don't do anything to make this
Mhm.
safe. Don't do anything to reduce content that's profitable. And we just have these like bare bones stuff for PR. So we can say we have it.
Yeah.
That's it.
And it's so harmful when it's harmful for so many reasons, and some of which we've talked about before and we'll talk about again. We just had this Not a Fantasy report and talking about the harms of image-based sexual abuse of adults or children when it's child sexual abuse material, when their videos are surfaced on these sites. But there also is then the harm on the other end of the screen. We talked about the sexual socialization of users who are viewing scenes,
Yeah,
whether it's, fictional or very often they're real, and the harm that that has in eroding empathy and in increasing demand and interest for that kind of content. Obviously, that's harmful for adults, but especially when we think about children then being on these sites. And that statistic that I noted from our flyer, which we'll have in the show notes, about about children being exposed to depictions of what appears to be or depictions of someone being in pain, or like you said, this concept of normalizing incest. And when we know that pornography is incredibly linked to child on child harmful sexual
exactly.
behavior, that children will view this material and then can act out in a sexually harmful way because they're copying what they've seen. So just the harms of what these companies are doing is so important to focus on, because I think someone might say, well, come on, a 14-year-old boy or 13-year-old boy, however old this child was when he was first exposed, being exposed to, risque content online, that's not an important thing to be concerned about or to sue a company over. But it clearly is important because that's why at least 20 states have passed regulations trying to protect kids from being exposed to this. And I don't know if there's more that you can share about what the experience of this family was, in the aftermath of being exposed to these porn sites. But I just think that it's so important for people to recognize it's not a matter of being prudish, it's a matter of protecting children from real harms.
Yeah, I mean, I don't wanna get too much into detail about our client, but I will say that he was becoming so distressed. He was only doing this for about a month, and was becoming so distressed and distraught because he could not stop. It was becoming impulsive and compulsive. So now he's in a cycle of looking at this he doesn't even want to, and looking at content that's making him uncomfortable he doesn't even wanna see, but he's still seeking it out, right? Because that's how pornography is, and that's how these sites are, is they're feeding you more and more shocking stuff. Truly, it's like they're just like social media companies are doing, but they're showing you shocking things to create an addiction cycle. But now it's
Mm,
tied up in your sexuality. And for which is confusing for anyone, but for a
mhm,
14-year-old child, detrimental, detrimental. And
mhm,
to touch on what you were saying, the way we know how childhood learning works. The way childhood learning works is from repeating, from acting out, what they see and what they're learning in the real world. And so it is a foregone conclusion that children will act out what they're seeing. And if it's violent, they're going to be acting out violence. And also, studies have shown that it even causes the children to internalize some of these models they're seeing
mm,
to themselves, right? So if the girls are seeing women abused repeatedly, they're internalizing that that is how they should receive sex and that is their sexual role, to be
yeah.
abused. And so and just the
Billie
societal
Eilish,
effect of
the pop star, has even spoken about that specifically, how as a young girl, she was exposed to it, and it made her think that that's what sex was, that it was something where a woman experienced violence and pain, and she reflected on it, really wishing that she hadn't been exposed to that content because it then informed some of her early sexual experiences in a really negative way because she was accepting of that kind of treatment.
yeah,
And so many
even
others
seeking
have
it
spoken about that as well.
Yeah, even seeking it out and then being so confused because they're being hurt by it, but they're, like, looking for they're all they think they wanting it and desiring it because that's informed their first sexual experiences were informed by that, and that is how adult predators work too, which I think a lot of people don't
Mhm,
understand what grooming and childhood sexual abuse is the predator is part of the reason why they're going after kids is because they have a innocent, malleable template to work with that they can then inform this malleable child about and create this child to be exactly what they want in terms of
mhm,
just a sexual object for them. And their life part of the lifelong damage is the kind of irreversible sexual impacts that has on the victim and how confusing that is because they feel like all their sexual experiences are like tainted by this
mm,
early childhood sexual experience. And we're doing this to our kids en masse by making pornography easily accessible to them. And that's what I mean. Like we're really grooming this generation. I'm not the first to say that, but it's just so palpable to me in just working with this family and seeing that, how quickly this could happen. And, you have sexual predators everywhere. And if a child's exposed to this kind of content, how much more vulnerable they will be to that predator. It's scary. And I think we just have to act to protect our kids. It's just time we have to, and we can't listen to these excuses anymore from these
mhm.
massive companies making tons of money.
Yes, who are tracking the data and know where you are,
Yeah.
and if you'll click an ad and they're tracking what you're doing often when you leave the site, so many of these different type of websites. I think too, there was Dr. Gail Dines, who's a feminist author of the book Pornland. I think in her book, Pornland, she interviewed a pornography producer who had a quote similar to what you were saying, where he was saying that, they used to have to really train people. He talked about women who entered the pornography industry as performers. And he said that now they come to the set, quote unquote, porn ready. And this porn producer said, you know, pornography and culture is doing all of the grooming for us, that people are internalizing all of these things. And on page 2 of that dangerous playground flyer that I had shown earlier at the bottom, we do have a couple of quotes from youth too who talk about the fact that they're experiencing harm from what they're seeing online.
Yeah.
Actually, here it has that quote from Billie Eilish that I referenced when she said, "I think it really destroyed my brain, and I feel incredibly devastated that I was exposed to so much porn." And there's another girl who's 16 years old who said, "I think pornography has made me react positively to non-consensual sex and violence against women." And then a boy, 19 years old, said, "Because of porn, I've slowly become unsociable towards my friends and family. I've never been able to have a romantic relationship and with anyone out besides the screen of my computer." Another just talks about being scared for his future relationships and well-being because he struggled so long with pornography addiction. And that's an 18-year-old having that kind of almost hopeless and like you described maybe is somewhat similar to the, victim in this case, just a feeling of distress and fear and anxiety because it can become so addictive, so compulsive, and so problematic for adults
Well,
also experience.
and we're talking about how the themes of these websites are inherently antisocial, right? So they're if they're violent, if they're promoting incest, they're promoting non-consensual, all these things that are, and even just like the degrading, like the spitting, choking, insulting language, like that, those are just those are antisocial behaviors. If you act that way in a public or social setting or a dating setting, things are not going to go well. They're not conducive to forming relationships. So and yet, I struggle. I'm frustrated sometimes because uh, most social commentators are recognizing this male loneliness epidemic they talk about. But even just sort of the epidemic of both men and women being unsatisfied with romantic relationships, having trouble
Mhm,
finding satisfying romantic relationships. They're struggling. And to me, the connection's so clear, right? Their early childhood sexual experiences were formed by very antisocial behavior. So if these young men are coming into a date, being very aggressive and nasty to the girls because they truly think like that's how you be a playboy and that's how you should act. Obviously, girls are not going to like it. Or if they play along with it because they think they're supposed to play along with it, that's you're really sowing into the relationship though resentment on both sides is not connective.
mhm,
So then we have sort of this issue where nobody's connecting, nobody's happy, they're angry with each other. Men and women are angry with each other, young people are.
mhm,
To your point from the beginning is we're not even just talking about one individual, it's societal harms at this
mhm.
point, widespread societal harms. And I think we're definitely seeing that.
Absolutely. With these lawsuits, as obviously you've been doing so much work preparing for them, they've launched, which is a huge achievement in and of itself. Do you anticipate what the primary opposition arguments might be?
I think they'll probably challenge the constitutionality of the law just because, again, these are fairly new measures. I'm sure they're gonna be watching what the Supreme Court does with Texas, but I imagine even if Supreme Court says, "Hey, Texas law is perfectly fine, A-okay," the Kansas law is slightly different. So I'm sure they would probably still try their hand at challenging that because the delay itself benefits them.
Mm,
Delay always benefits, these companies because it just gets harder and harder for the child to wanna go through this whole thing the longer it takes, right? And more expensive for their lawyers. I imagine they're gonna try and raise 230 it somehow. I
mm,
don't see how it could possibly apply in this case, but because they're a website, they'll probably try it. And so then I don't know. I think in general, they're gonna say that for some reason they weren't obligated to comply with this law. They may if they're a foreign company, they may use that. They may say, "Yeah, we're a foreign company, we don't have to comply." If they're a US company, I'm sure they'll still find a way to say either, "We did, the check a box was enough," or, "We weren't obligated, it wasn't constitutional," or, "Even if we didn't, the child wasn't really hurt." Those are
mhm.
the kinds of things they're gonna say. And they're definitely gonna try everything in the book, I think,
Yeah.
and make this as difficult and drawn out as possible. But it will be very important to in some regards, it's fine that they try all those things because as we defeat each one of them and progress through the case, that just creates precedent. It creates a pathway for other states to follow, for other victims to follow, and starts setting. I have confidence that we will be successful. I hope that we will, even if maybe we have to go through the appeals process at different points in this litigation, because of all the things we said. I think the information is out there now. It's robust. We have the facts on our side and the truth on our side on this. And so now we just need the court system to grapple with that. And once they do, when you have, whether it's the judge or the jury, ultimately siding with the child and saying, yes, this website should have complied with that, and they didn't, and the child was harmed, that has ripple effects because
Mhm.
the other websites out there are gonna be watching and thinking, "Well, we know what the conclusion will be if we roll the dice and have to go through this process." So, rather just comply, and so it changes the industry, and it, sends a message to, I think, more than just these porn companies. I think it starts laying the groundwork for, hopefully, all websites to be more responsible in this space.
That's so true, and I'm so glad that you laid that out for us too, because I think that's part of what the Nkosi Law Center has a really unique mission in that it does take on challenging cases, pioneering cases very often, not necessarily just the ones that are open and shut, and it's for that purpose in order to pave the path to help get better precedents for survivors in the future. And like you said, every step forward that these cases have has so many ripple effects for general education, awareness,
Yeah.
and even just in small measures, shifting those incentives for these corporations or the industries because they can see that good case law can happen and
That's
there
right.
is progress that can be made. Is there
Absolutely.
anything,
Absolutely.
um, is there anything else that you want to make sure that people really understand about this case?
I just invite you to, read our blog about it, read up about it, find out if your state has an age verification law. If it doesn't, ask your representatives to pass one. Say you want one, and if you do have one, if something like this happens to you and you do have an age verification law, reach out to us. Let's bring a lawsuit on your behalf. We want to support these laws. We want them to be successful and we want them to be effective. And so that's what we think these laws, that's why these lawsuits are important. They're important for making those laws effective and deterring this bad behavior.
Thank you so much, Danny, for all the work that you and the Law Center are doing on this issue. And we'll put a link also in the show notes to a web page where people can get in touch with the Law Center if they've had similar experiences or have a case that they would want to discuss with you all. And I just encourage everyone listening to share this with a friend. Please like and subscribe. It really helps our numbers. Maybe leave a comment wherever you're listening. Really grateful to have you all in this journey with us in ending sexploitation.